Certainly, beginning early on when I was young, I did my undergraduate degree at the University of Sydney, and I did Australian degrees was 3 years, but if you did well, they would invite you to do a fourth year and write a long dissertation as part of that fourth year. I did that. I got offered scholarships in various places for my PhD and chose to go to the Australian National University, not because of its location. Canberra is a really boring city, but because someone I wanted to work with was there, a man named Ranajit Guha, who had just written a discipline-changing book and was also the editor of a new series called Subaltern Studies, which transformed Indian history writing and also became one of the streams that fed into postcolonial theory. So I went there, I did my dissertation on Marxist theory and nationalist politics in colonial India, which later became my first book. And that was a book about how ideas travel, about how Marxism, born in Western Europe, where there was a proletariat, industrialization, a capitalist class, how it traveled to colonial India, where there was a very small working class and a small bourgeoisie. And I was interested in why is it that ideas and theories and ideologies are so mobile. I didn't know it then, but today I describe it as I was interested in globalization before the term became, a common one. And the next book was sort of like that too, except I was now interested not in how an ideology, a formal ideology, traveled, but rather in the structure of knowledge which is now global, but which began in Western Europe, again, following the scientific revolution and then the establishment of disciplines like history and philosophy and so on. And I was interested in how and why that became global. And this was a book about the introduction of Western education into colonial India and the way it transformed not just knowledge, but subjectivities, the way in which the sort of people we are. And that was called Subject Lessons, subtitled The Western Education of Colonial India. And that was nominated for the International Convention of Asian Scholars. It was shortlisted for their prize. The next book, which came out a couple of years ago, was called Beyond Reason, Postcolonial Theory in the Social Sciences. Up to now, my books, not all my articles, but my books had used India as a sort of archive. Not because I did write about Indian history, but in a way I wanted to use India as my archive to ask bigger questions which were not limited to India. My hope was that it would have the thick texture of a historical work, but ask questions that were of interest not just to other Indian historians. So with this third book, I dropped my Indian archive and just plunged purely into sort of theoretical and philosophical questions. And it's a book that's a sort of critique of a knowledge which has now become global, but, or so I argue, is not universal. And the distinction is this now dominates universities, governments everywhere, and I don't think there's any way out of it. But at the same time, the claim that it's global because it's true is one that seems to me worth some sort of critical examination. And that brings me up to the present, except that what I'm working on now, and it's a newish project, is a bit of a change. I'm now interested in why is it that the struggle against colonialism, which has always been one way or another part of my work, why is it that anti-colonialism in almost all cases culminated in the nation state? In other words, why is it that the idea that we must be liberated from our colonial oppressors took the form of saying we must have our own nation state, flag, army, etc., etc., etc.? Because it seems to us that because that's what happened, it seems like it was bound to happen. But there's nothing obvious about it. In the 19th and in the early 20th century, there were all sorts of anti-colonial movements, often mass movements, which weren't nationalist movements. And yet by about 1920, it seems obvious to almost everyone that to be anti-colonial is also to be a nationalist. And I'm now inquiring into how and why that happened. Principally by invitation. I'm very new to St Andrews, so when I joined, in fact even before I joined, I just looked up what happens there and so on. And this seemed to me there's a number of very good centres. This seemed to me like a lively centre that brought together diverse interests, because I'm not really, as the description may have indicated, I'm not really an IR scholar. I'm an interdisciplinary scholar with an interest in IR, amongst other things. And one of the nice things about this centre is that it is, as even its title indicates, interdisciplinary. It's not about a single thing, but about a multiplicity of things and how they come together in order to shape the world that we inhabit. And it's got some, intellectually lively and curious people involved in it, and I thought it might be a good thing to be involved in. Well, there are many, but I'd point to two out of the many that interest me. I think they're actually very important, but they're also especially of interest to me. And they're linked. One is the decline of American power. I think what we're seeing is, Trump's throwing his weight around. America is still by far the biggest player on the field, but it is an empire in decline. And I think how that decline manifests itself, how it's managed both by the United States and by all the other people affected by it, which is everyone, is going to be one of the big issues of the next few decades. Connected to that, but also distinct, I think, is a growing consensus amongst the global South, itself a highly differentiated entity, but nonetheless a growing consensus that the talk of a rules-based international order is just arrant hypocrisy. It was basically, there was never any rules, it was basically might ruling over. Now, I think that's been felt in the global South for a very long time, but after the Third World Project effectively was crushed or came to an end in the late 70s, early 80s, most leaders in the global South sort of figured, well, this is the world that we have and there's no point in railing against it. I think things are changing, and I think it's partly because as the Third World differentiates, there are major powers emerging out of what was formerly the Third World, China and India being two exemplary instances. So they're able to speak more freely and just stronger, have more of a presence on the world stage. The other is a conjunctural event. I think that the juxtaposition of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and what is happening in Palestine made it blindingly obvious that there is no rules-based order, that the death of Ukrainians is a fact to be lamented, which indeed it is, and that Russia is to be, reproached and fought for its invasion, but that the bombings of innocent Palestinian civilians in Gaza and the incursions in the West Bank is something that the larger part of the world doesn't, and certainly Europe and North America could not care less about. There's a little bit of rhetorical this and that, beating of breasts and so on. But in reality, if you juxtapose the response to Ukraine to the response to Gaza, it becomes blindingly obvious. And I think in the Third World, there's a very strong and growing sentiment that this talk of the rules-based international order, which we always thought was pretty much nonsense, is now incontestably revealed as a form of hypocrisy. Now, what the consequences of that are, I don't know, but that, I think, will be one of the interesting things to watch in the years and possibly the decades to come.